Monitoring and maintaining FME Server. So I'm Stuart Harper. I'm kind of the product manager for FME Server. From FME Cloud. This is Claude Vassar, and he, if you will come here, you're kind of the you built FME Cloud, right? So you started from the start, and you started, and then you've iterated and iterated and iterated, and you've just been learning all the time, right? So he's built up a wealth of knowledge as Claude, essentially, on how to keep FME Server running in a lot of circumstances. So we've been iterating and stabilizing, running FME Server, and so this presentation, what it's all about is kind of sharing some of that knowledge with you and passing some of that knowledge on. And the mindset on this, so this is just kind of the way we think in the cloud team. So firstly, now Linux is a first-class citizen within safe software. There's a huge amount of work that's going on to make sure that the test suite up to date and everything's running correctly on Linux. Second, server should automatically recover. So if one of the processes fails on FME Server or some of the internals fails, then things should recover. That's the second thing. We should be allowed to remotely debug, which Claude will talk about in a lot more detail. Expect the unexpected. That's a key thing on the cloud. We could lose network, we could lose hardware, we could have some kind of operating system issue. So we always have to expect the unexpected. And crucially, do not reinvent the wheel. Always try and use services if you can and not code. So with that, I'll pass you over to Claude, and he's going to walk you through what he's done.
Yeah, thank you. So before I actually start about talking about details, what we did in the cloud to improve the uptime, I want to start to talk a bit about what you need to do to actually be able to maintain uptime with FME Server, and that is collecting data. And with collecting data, I mean server monitoring. So if you want to have a chance to debug your FME Server or your system in general, you need to have some metrics, and you need to have them available for a certain time span. So for example, let's say you have a FME Server and you have a schedule running, and that schedule runs every night. Then in the morning you come into the office and something went wrong, so your complete server is unresponsive. It's good to have somewhere a set of metrics, so like disk usage, CPU load, memory, network traffic, during that period, so that you can look at what potentially happened during that time with your server. There are tons of services out there you can use for that, and they can be either used in-house, or they can be deployed. They can be used as a web service in the internet. The second thing is logs. So I highly recommend, if you have a production system, collect either all of the logs or a subset of the logs centralized. So with centralized, I mean submit them to other service of your server. So what that allows you to do is you can search through them, and you can filter them by either time or keywords or log files. And again, in the case of a crash, it often is very, very useful to have different types of logs and access them at the same time. So you can often see a trace of the crash propagating through the different files, and that's very, very helpful to debug. To clarify, in FME Cloud, we collect logs, but not FME Server logs. We only collect system logs, because FME Server logs is customer data, so we do not touch them, and we do not have access to them. Based on logs and system metric, it's possible to create alerts. So often, if you use a web service, for example, for collecting metrics or logs, those services come with integrated alerts. So you can just, in logs, for example, you can create an alert whenever a certain keyword appears in a certain log file. For system metrics, you can create an alert when your load goes above a certain value for a defined period. And the tricky thing with alerting we found is actually not getting an alert, but getting not too many alerts. the danger with that is if you constantly getting alerts, you start ignoring them. So it often takes a while to tweak the values until you have you only get the important alerts. And what helped us with that a lot as well is like using tiered system. So if you want to have just a notice about something, I don't want to get that on my phone. I want just to have a look at them every once in a while. And so we use, for example, Slack, our chat app, for all those low priority alert. But if something really goes wrong, I want to have an escalation right on my phone and know it immediately. So there, it takes often a while until you get it right, but it's well worth it to spend the time. So now that is what we use in FME Cloud. The different services in the red box are supporting us to maintain uptime and keep FME Server and also our web stack alive. I don't really want to recommend any of the services. I'm happy to chat after the presentation if you want a recommendation. But basically, once you decide you want to either collect metrics or logs, do your research yourself and find the right tool for your need, because there are a lot of solutions with pros and cons, and often you get a free trial. There are also open source tools. So yeah, I recommend just look into it yourself. So now, what did we actually do in the cloud to maintain high uptime with FME Server? So I like to refer to FME Server as a beast, because it can be quite tricky to keep it alive under certain circumstances. Especially in the cloud, we face, I guess, kind of a unique challenge that we don't really know what's going to happen on the server. So we don't know what the idea of the customer is, how are they going to use the server. So we don't know if it's going to be a high memory workflow, we don't know if it's going to be a high CPU workflow. So this can result in like really unexpected behavior. And one thing, it's not such a problem anymore in the latter days, but it was a huge problem in the early days, and that is that logs filled up the disk. And if you have a full disk, your server will crash immediately and really ugly. So what I recommend, if you set up a production system, make sure you check in after a couple days, after a couple weeks, and ensure no logs remain on the system without that they're rotated and cleaned up. And that can be system logs, logs from your apps, or FME Server logs. FME Server got pretty good in the like 2016, 2017 with cleaning up after itself, but it's still worth to check if everything is fine. The next thing we realized is that that's a more Linux-specific problem, that the FME Server service script shipped with the default installer, they bundle up processes. So when you start like the Tomcat, it also will start like the cleanup service and the WebSocket server. And this caused quite a bit of headache when we try to use uptime tools like Monit or systemd to watch those processes. So what I recommend, if you're planning on using uptime tools or just in general, debundle those processes and make sure you only start one process at a time with your service script. The next thing is Nginx. We released a blog post about that last fall, and Nginx is a high-performance web server, and with the latest generation of FME Cloud instances, Nginx is always running as the web layer. So every traffic coming into your FME Cloud instance will go through Nginx. So what that gave us is that we could have one centralized SSL configuration for all public-facing services. So that would be like Tomcat, so the web server, the WebSocket server, and also email. It also gave us the ability to not run Tomcat as root, which is from the security perspective like a nice thing to have. And we can now serve all static files like JavaScript files or CSS files, images, directly through Nginx, and Tomcat doesn't need to deal with that. And that is quite a bit more efficient compared to before that. And then the last thing I want to talk about that, and that's probably the most important thing, beware of the engine. So the engine is really, really powerful, and it can do a lot, and it can also do a lot of damage if you're not careful. So I really, really recommend not to run the engine as root on Linux until you have a really, really good reason to do so. On Windows, I'm not quite familiar how the user management is, but basically make sure the engine does not have unlimited permissions on your system. Because if a user uploads a workspace to your FME server and, for example, uses the system caller, that system caller inherits the permissions of the engine. So in Linux, for example, you could delete the full file system if you run as root. That's probably often not a problem because you trust your users, but still, the user might not really know what he's doing, so I still recommend not to use root. The second thing is be aware that the engine can take a lot of resources, especially memory. And on Linux, this had like a funny side effect in the cloud. So whenever a Linux system runs out of memory, the kernel looks at all the processes and decides, okay, what's the best process to kill and free up memory? So unfortunately, in FME Cloud, this was for most of the time the Tomcat web server. So what would happen, the engine started using a lot of memory, and then Tomcat got killed, and the server went offline. So what we did to address that, there is a thing called OOM score, and it basically allows you to set priorities, what processes should be killed first. So we adjusted the core, that score in a way that the engine is always the first process to be killed whenever the system runs out of memory. And that improved the stability a lot of FME Cloud instances. Yeah, that was it. I don't want to talk much longer. I see everybody is waiting for the ice cream. So I'm around for the ice cream. So if you have questions, you can either ask them now or we can chat afterwards. And yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I haven't really. Well, I have looked into the cloud, but not really that much. Can you configure the Nginx that's running on the cloud?
What?
For caching or caching sessions.
So can you repeat that? Like what would you like to configure from on Nginx?
I don't really know, but for example, all the static images and caching only some, for example, from certain sources that you're allowed to cache, and some sources that you don't want to cache.
So in the cloud, we ship it with like a default configuration. So we know from the FME server side, we know what we can cache and what we can't. So there you can't modify anything. But if you would like to actually use Nginx in your like personal deployment of FME server, we're about to release eventually a knowledge article about that, and then there you can obviously modify and add or remove resources you want to cache. Did I answer your question, or?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah, it's not out yet, but it's coming. It's coming. But yeah, we can chat afterwards. Fine. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The documentation for FME Server, it has a requirement for Apache Tomcat. I'm not sure exactly why, but is that because there's a deployment that is required to deploy as onto Apache Tomcat, and does Nginx support the same type of deployment?
So Apache Tomcat is necessary to run the FME Server web tier. So that is a Java web app. So I think officially, I'm not sure if you officially or unofficially support also WebLogic from Oracle, I think, for that purpose. And Nginx is on top of that. So Nginx itself does not allow to run Java apps. So you will need a web server able to interpret those like jar files, WAR files, and run them. But then Nginx is just the reverse proxy on top, and Nginx can obviously be replaced as well with other tools like the Apache web server you could, for example, use for the same purpose. We just picked Nginx because we found it's the probably easiest tool to use for that purpose. Okay. I think that's it.
Thanks.